The first thing my mother reached for was almost never the medicine cabinet. It wasn't because she refused modern medicine. It wasn't because she believed every old remedy was better. It was because she believed there was wisdom in learning what generations before us had already discovered. Growing up in our Amish community, every home had certain things you could almost count on finding. Fresh bread cooling on the counter, bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, glass jars quietly lining pantry shelves, and somewhere, usually wrapped in a clean cloth and tucked safely inside a wooden cupboard, there was always a small black tin. It wasn't fancy. There was no colorful label, no company logo, no instructions printed on the side, just a simple metal tin with a dark salve inside. The first time I truly noticed it, I was helping my father stack firewood. Like most little girls, I wanted to carry the same size logs he carried. I reached too quickly and drove a long splinter deep into my palm. I remember trying to be brave. I remember telling everyone I was fine. But by supper my hand had become sore, and every little movement reminded me that Splinter was still there. Mother looked at my hand for only a moment. She didn't panic. She didn't rush. She disappeared into the pantry. A moment later she returned, carrying that familiar little container I'd seen dozens of times, but had never paid much attention to. She opened the lid. Inside was a thick, dark salve, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It smelled faintly of pine, herbs, beeswax, and something earthy that reminded me of the garden after a summer rain. She gently spread a little over the splinter, wrapped my hand with a clean cloth, and told me we'd look at it again the next morning. That evening I asked her the question every child eventually asks. "Mother," she laughed softly. "Oh, child," she said. Looking back now, I realized she wasn't talking about the ingredients. She was talking about the generations, because that little tin had a history much older than either of us. Long before modern pharmacies stood on every street corner, families depended on knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Grandmothers taught daughters. Daughters taught granddaughters. Not everything survived, but the things that truly helped families were remembered. Recipes were copied by hand. Measurements weren't written in teaspoons. They were remembered by sight, by feel, by experience. My mother learned to make that salve from her own mother. Her mother learned from hers. And somewhere before that, the recipe had crossed an ocean with families who carried very little besides their faith, their work ethic, and the practical knowledge they refused to leave behind. That's one thing I always admired about the older women in our community. They believed knowledge should never be wasted. If they discovered a better way to preserve food, they shared it. If they found a plant useful around the home, they taught their daughters how to recognize it. If a recipe had served the family well for 30 years, they saw no reason to keep it secret. They believed useful knowledge belonged to the community, not just to one household. One winter evening, after everyone had gone home from supper, I asked Mother another question. She smiled before answering. She looked down at the salve resting on the table and gently ran her finger across the lid. That sentence stayed with me for years. Today we live in a world where almost everything comes ready-made. If we need soap, we buy it. If we need lotion, we buy it. If we need ointment, we buy it. There's nothing wrong with that, but there is something quietly satisfying about understanding how earlier generations solved everyday problems using the materials they had around them. That little black tin reminded me that practical knowledge once lived inside ordinary kitchens, not laboratories, not factories, kitchens. When I grew older, Mother finally invited me to help her make a fresh batch. She spread every ingredient across the kitchen table before we began. Some had been gathered from our own garden. Others had been carefully dried weeks earlier. Nothing was rushed. Nothing wasted. She believed every ingredient deserved respect because every ingredient had taken time to grow. As we worked, she explained each one, not with scientific words, not with complicated explanations, just simple observations collected over a lifetime. Listening to her felt less like following a recipe and more like listening to family history. The recipe mattered, but the stories mattered mattered even more, because every ingredient carried a memory, every memory carried a lesson, and every lesson reminded me that the women before us didn't simply preserve food. They preserved wisdom. That more than anything is what I remember every time I see a little black tin sitting quietly on a pantry shelf. Mother always believed that understanding why an ingredient was there mattered just as much as knowing how much to use. She would place each ingredient on the table before we ever lit the stove. Every one of these has a purpose, she'd say. The first was beeswax. That was the foundation. Without beeswax, the mixture would stay in oil. With it, the salve became something you could carry in a little tin, keep in a pantry, or tuck into an apron pocket while working outside. Then came the charcoal. When I was younger, I thought charcoal belonged in the cook stove or under the barbecue. Mother smiled when I said that. She explained that activated charcoal had been valued in many traditional remedies because people believed it helped draw unwanted impurities toward itself. Even today, scientists recognize that activated charcoal has a very large surface area that allows it to absorb certain substances. To Mother, however, the science came second. She trusted what generations before her had continued making. Next came plantain, not the fruit, the little green plant that many people pull from their yards without giving it a second thought. My mother would often kneel in the grass and point to it. Most people see a weed, she'd tell me. Plantain had been part of our family's herb garden for as long as anyone could remember. The older women appreciated it for generations because they believed it helped soothe irritated skin and belonged in almost every household salve they made. Then there was calendula. Those cheerful orange and yellow blossoms brightened the garden all summer. Mother loved them because they reminded her that useful plants could also be beautiful. She believed calendula gave the salve a gentle touch and never made a batch without adding a handful of carefully dried petals. Sometimes she'd also add a little pine resin. The smell alone filled the kitchen. To this day, whenever I catch that scent while walking through the woods, I think of my mother's kitchen table. Every family had little differences. Some recipes stayed very simple. Others included herbs passed down through one particular family. That was part of the beauty of old traditions. No two grandmothers made everything exactly the same. When all the ingredients were ready, Mother worked slowly. The beeswax melted first, then the oils, then the powdered herbs or infused oils she had prepared earlier. Nothing boiled, nothing hurried. She stirred with the same old wooden spoon she used for countless other recipes. I still smile when I remember that. Once everything had blended together, she poured the warm salve into little round tins and set them on the windowsill to cool. The waiting was often the hardest part. As children, we wanted to poke the top to see if it had hardened yet. Mother always laughed. Years later, I realized she said that about far more than salve. As the years passed, I began noticing something. Every woman in our community seemed to have her own little tin. One stayed beside the kitchen sink. Another rested near the sewing basket. Some kept one in the barn. Others carried one while gardening. It wasn't unusual to see someone quietly reach for that familiar tin after a long afternoon pulling weeds or working with rough wood. To us, it was simply part of everyday life. One afternoon, while we were pulling carrots together, I asked Mother why she thought so many traditions had disappeared. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she brushed the dirt from another carrot and placed it gently into the basket. That answer has stayed with me for decades. Recipes disappeared. Gardens became smaller. Pantries became emptier. Families grew busier, and somewhere along the way, many of the little things that quietly served families for generations were forgotten. Now, that doesn't mean every old remedy should replace modern medicine. Mother never believed that. If someone had a serious wound, signs of infection, or an illness that continued getting worse, she believed they should seek proper medical care without delay. She respected doctors. She respected nurses. She simply believed there was also value in remembering practical household knowledge that had served ordinary families for generations. That balance always impressed me. She never treated traditional remedies as magic. She treated them as part of caring for a home. Perhaps that's why I still make a small batch every year. Not because I expect one little tin to solve every problem, but because making it reminds me of my mother. It reminds me to slow down, to work carefully, to pay attention, to value knowledge that was earned through years of observation and shared with love. Whenever my grandchildren ask about the little black tin sitting quietly on my pantry shelf, I don't begin with the ingredients. I begin with the story, because stories are how traditions survive. Anyone can follow a recipe, but understanding why someone kept making it year after year, that is where the real lesson lives. The older I become, the more I believe our greatest inheritance isn't found in money or property. It's found in ordinary moments around an ordinary kitchen table. A mother patiently explaining why she adds one more handful of herbs, a daughter quietly listening, a recipe carefully written on a worn piece of paper, a small black tin placed back on the shelf, ready for another season. Those are the things that built families. Those are the things that carried knowledge through generations. And perhaps that's why forgotten Amish knowledge still matters today. Not because it asks us to live exactly as our grandparents did, but because it reminds us that wisdom is often simple, practical, and patiently passed from one pair of hands to the next. If there is one lesson my mother left me, it is this: never underestimate the value of learning the old ways. Not every tradition belongs in a museum. Some still belong in our kitchens, our gardens, and our homes, waiting patiently for someone willing to learn them, preserve them, and one day pass them along.